Just before getting started, want to thank the Wool family for the speaker series. This is our last speaker of the academic calendar, and we'll be back in the fall with some awesome new additional programming. We also just want to give a shout out to the Health, Spirituality, and Religion program student fellows who are graduating today and will be doctors by the time that the sun sets tonight. So that's really exciting. We are like so amazed by their I would say their growth, but it's not even that. They've really contributed to kind of the program and to us, and we're really excited for the impact that they'll have on patient care as well as some, thinking big thoughts. So we're really excited for them as well. Want to warmly welcome our speaker. Rabbanit Leah Sarna is the spiritual leader of Congregation Sha'arei Orah in Lower Merion, Pennsylvania. She serves on the faculty of the Drisha Institute for Jewish Education. She is currently writing a book tentatively titled Begetting and Beginning, the Torah of Pregnancy, Birth, and the Beginning of Life. This talk is drawn from her prize-winning essay, Catastrophic Miracles and Miraculous Catastrophes, the Torah of Pregnancy in Tazria and Toldot. She's going to be talking to us today about that, those ideas. And so without further ado, here's Rabbanit Leah Sarna.
Hi, everyone. Such a pleasure to be with you today. I always just start by explaining what my title is because most people have never heard of it before. So Rabbanit is just a feminization of the word rabbi. Hebrew is a gendered language, so nouns have genders. Doctors in Hebrew are either a rofeh if they're men or a rofa if they're women. So rabbis are Rav if they're men and Rabbanit if they're women. And obviously people who don't feel comfortable in that gender binary struggle with gendered languages in general, and modern Hebrew is trying to figure that out. But women Torah scholars have been using this title since the 1500s. And so in our times, I'm one of the first 25 Orthodox women rabbis. My mom is one of the first 100 women rabbis ever. It's all very new for us, for the Jews, to have women in these types of positions. And it feels really important to connect to the few women kind of sprinkled throughout our history who have been Torah scholars. And so that's just my way of like a little orientation to maybe that told you something about who I am and what I bring to this also, and my particular interest then in like experiences that involve the female body, because there's a lot, and we're going to see today together a lot of texts that address and discuss the female body. The Jewish canon is like, and the Torah canon is not afraid of any topic, but it's always going to be coming through the voices of men, and we'll see that really explicitly. We're going to see Rebecca, the matriarch Rebecca in the book of Genesis. She gets a line or two, but then all of the interpreters of her that we're going to see are going to be men. And so I always like to sort of like front that and address it and say like this is something that's being developed currently, and we're the inheritors, and so we're all the scientists, by the way, inheritors of traditions that were largely created by men, and now thankfully pushed forward by women who are lucky enough in our generations to be the inheritors of all the wisdom that came before us. So that's kind of a word about me and my stake in this project. And I'm going to share my screen. I have a little slideshow just to help us keep oriented together. Okay, so that's just the title. Okay, so I want to say a little bit about how the Jewish library works, because we sometimes talk about the Torah, and different people who use that word mean really different things. So sometimes when we say the Torah, we really just mean like Jewish books, kind of very, very broadly. And sometimes when we say the Torah, we mean the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And sometimes when we say the Torah, we mean those 5 books and the 2 major corpuses of Jewish literature that surround them. So one of those is commentary. Fun fact, when printing was invented, the Pentateuch in Hebrew printed for Jews was not printed without commentary until until basically like the first printing press in the state of Israel. So we have 400 years where the Torah was always printed with commentary. That is the traditional way that the Jews study commentary. So when we talk about commentary, the first commentaries were translations. We have translations, a Jewish translation into Aramaic, the Greek translation being the Septuagint. It's much less important to Jews, but there were Jews, notably maybe if you've ever heard of Philo, for example, who that was really their encounter with the Torah. Greek-speaking Jews, let's say in Egypt, in the first century, did not necessarily have access to Hebrew texts. They didn't have access to Hebrew language. They encountered the Torah exclusively through Greek. So they did play a very important role in kind of the Jewish tradition. But then once we get to the Middle Ages, we're much more talking about commentaries. There's a word in the Torah, the commentator says, here's what this word means, or here's what this half a verse means, or let me connect it to something else. And then different kinds of types of commentaries with different types of goals, sometimes tying the Torah into a more mystical tradition, sometimes tying the Torah into just like grammar, like literally, let's break down what does this word mean. People specifically under kind of more influence from like Arabic speaking cultures were really interested in grammar, because in the Middle Ages and in Arabic speaking places, that was something that they really prized. And so Jews learned how to prize it as well within our own language. So all different types of commentaries, and they're really important in our tradition. And then the other thing that we have is called midrash. Midrash is kind of like a commentary, but it's also a little bit different. It can be a little bit more like fan fiction. So instead of asking, what does this word mean? It can be like, ask a question that the text itself doesn't answer. So for example, when Abraham appears onto the scene in the Pentateuch, he's just kind of there. Like, he's born, and then he has a family, and then God talks to him. But the Midrash is going to ask, why did God choose Abraham? What was special about him? How did Abraham come into a relationship with God such that when God spoke to him, he knew it was God speaking? Right? All those types of questions, which the text itself does not address. The Midrash, in its like fan fiction-y style, is going to start asking those much bigger questions, and then it'll weave stories based on tradition and imagination in answer to those questions. And the Midrash can also just refer to early discussion by rabbis who lived, let's say, in the first through third, fourth centuries of the Common Era around these texts. So again, not exactly a commentary, not asking necessarily a question, what does this word mean, but asking more like, we'll see some of it, so you'll have maybe more of an understanding. Like let's say the text we're going to see today, they're going to talk about pregnancy, and then the rabbis are going to be like, oh yeah, like I have all these other questions about pregnancy also. And then the Midrash will kind of be the home for that whole conversation. So it'll really expand on plain meaning, but there are also rules sometimes for how Midrash works. So different we call them like schools of Midrash. And again, this is all like ancient texts. It use different hermeneutic tools to determine, maybe especially when it comes to legal texts, like what does this law mean? How should we understand it? How should we apply it? And they'll use tools, imagination, tradition to all kind of expand on the Torah's stated laws and narratives, which is all to say that the Jewish library is enormous, because in neither of these things, not commentary and not midrash, include, let's say, the Talmud, which is also the Jewish legal library, which we're not really going to be looking at today so much, but it's worth just mentioning because the Talmud is kind of this core Jewish text. Like if we had to say, what are the two most important Jewish texts? We would say the Pentateuch, probably. We would say the Pentateuch and the Talmud. And so this is just stuff around the Pentateuch. The Talmud then has all its own stuff. So the Talmud then has all of its own commentaries and its own sort of attendant library. And then there's like the mystical tradition, which is its own thing. So the Jewish library is just enormous. And within that library, a core feature of it is that it's multivocal. So core texts like the Talmud, Midrash, commentaries, they read much more like a conversation than they do like statute or law that you're used to. Meaning, like if you open up I don't know, like the code of the state of Michigan. I don't know how Michigan writes down its laws, but like if you were going to open up a law that the state was going to pass, it would not look anything like the way law gets discussed in the Talmud, even though we would all say that the Talmud is Judaism's central legal text. So just as an example of that, if you open up the Talmud to page number 1, which really the Talmud starts on page 2, but you open up to page 2, which is really page 1, and you will see the following question. What is the latest time that a person could recite the Shema, which is the core prayer of Judaism and our statement of faith? What is the latest time a person can recite that in the evening? And you will immediately see 3 different opinions. So you'll see an opinion by Rabbi Eliezer, who says it's till the end of the first third of the night. The rabbis are going to come along and say until midnight. And we have Rabban Gamliel, who says the latest time is until dawn. And then you'll have a story about Rabban Gamliel. So not only do you have 3 different opinions, you also have narrative mixed in with the law. And that's just like normal. Jews who start studying these texts, I encountered this text for the first time, I think when I was in like 2nd grade. Like that's how early and foundational texts like these are. So to me, the first time I saw what other types of laws look like when I saw what statutes look like in the United States, I was like, oh, this is so boring. Like this is so dry and bland, because Jewish law is just like an explosion of creativity and different opinions and different options. And so for people who spend time with Jewish texts, this type of kind of explosive multivocal dynamic is really normal. Our minds are trained. I mentioned, like, I've encountered this text for the first time as a 2nd grader, right? I was like 6 or 7 years old at that time, probably 7. And so I was trained from a very young age to hold multiple possibilities and approaches and opinions within my mind. And eventually the law does sort of come together. Like it's not the case that like every night I'm like, oh, like what's the latest time I should I should say this prayer. Like it comes together in like this is the time, and then there's like, oh well, if you missed it then you can still say it until this time. So there ends up being a space for that. The other way that we sometimes resolve these types of disputes is actually a compromise. So if you've ever been to a Jewish person's home, or if you're a Jewish person who has a home, you might have a mezuzah on your door. It's a little box on the door, in the doorpost, with a little scroll inside of it. The scroll is the important part, not the box. And you put it up on your door, and it's supposed to go up, not vertical and not horizontal, but at a slant. And the reason for that is because there's a debate whether it goes vertical or horizontal. And so the resolution is that it goes at a diagonal. So that's sort of another way of holding these multivocal approaches when they apply to practical law. So today we're going to talk about pregnancy, and what we're talking about is really not practical law at all, more just like a mindset. And when we have, this happens all over the place in the Torah canon and in Jewish law, where it's something that's just like not fully legal, but there's tons of discussion about it, and we have lots of different ways of thinking about it. And in those cases, when there's no sort of practical ramification, we almost always leave the debate open and leave options for thinking about things in multiple ways. And that's exactly what happens with pregnancy. And the reason why I'm so grateful to be having the opportunity today to speak to practitioners and doctors is because I think this way of thinking is a little bit unique. And certainly in the motherhood discourse, it is very unusual. The motherhood discourse is fun. I know doctors are always working against this, so you guys are definitely fighting for the good guys. But if you go on Instagram or whatever, right, the motherhood discourse is always, if you don't do it this way, your baby will not go to college. If you don't breastfeed, like your baby will die. If you don't put your baby to sleep wearing exactly this type of product, like everything's going to be a disaster. Like it's all very my way or the highway. And the Jewish tradition is like really not into that. And I think therefore presents a really important intervention into that type of discourse and for motherhood in general. So even when it comes to breastfeeding, we have Jewish texts that talk about breastfeeding as being like the most beautiful, most connective, most amazing thing a person can do. And 2 seconds later, breastfeeding is terrible. You should outsource it whenever possible. If you can pay someone else to do it for you, you should. And both of those texts are just, they just stand within our tradition. And what that means is that if breastfeeding is going amazing for you, then you can find texts about how God breastfed the Jewish people when they wandered through the desert via the manna that resembled breast milk, and like how amazing that was, that at the beginning of Jewish peoplehood, you have that close relationship between God and Israel, and that's the same as the relationship between a mother and her baby, and how wonderful is that? And if it's not going well for you, then you have texts that say the total opposite, and you can find a voice that you feel represented by, all within this tradition that's so complicated and multivocal. And to me, that just feels so important, that we can say yes to both experiences, and affirm all the experiences and hold them with complexity. So that's what I'm going to be presenting today, about the kind of experience of pregnancy overall. We're going to see it through two different narratives. So we're going to look at Leviticus 12, chapter 12, where we're going to see the Midrash in particular taking off on just one verse and going into a discussion about all of the miracles of pregnancy. And then we're going to see Genesis 25, which is the story of Rebecca. Rebecca is the first and only described pregnancy. She's the only, lots of people get pregnant, but it's always 2 words. It's just they get pregnant and then they have their baby. Sometimes people in the Pentateuch don't even get pregnant, they just have babies, which is obviously even more astonishing. What it means is that the pregnancy is just implied, but usually, right, the experience is like a silent experience. It's an experience that's just glided over. But Rebecca actually tells us what her body feels like and what her brain feels like during her pregnancy. And that, I think, is really important. And then at the end, so we'll go through both Leviticus 12 and Genesis 25. And then at the end, I'm going to talk about some of the differences between Leviticus 12 and Genesis 25, and why I think it's so amazing that the rabbis have the discussion that they do about Leviticus 12 and not import that discussion into Genesis 25. Like that, the discussion about pregnancy being so amazing and so miraculous, it's so perfect that the rabbis chose to have that discussion on Leviticus 12. Because if they had had it on Genesis 25, I think they would be really doing damage. And it gives us an opportunity to reflect on how we talk about pregnancy and when's the appropriate time to talk about sort of what piece of that experience, and when are we kind of sharing, wow, like this is amazing, and when are we sharing, okay, your experience is horrible. It doesn't matter how cool fetal DNA is, like your experience is horrible, and we're going to center that experience. And seeing kind of ancient and medieval rabbis modeling that within the Jewish tradition has been very important to me. So that's what we're going to look at today. And hopefully we'll have lots of time for questions at the end. Okay, so here's Leviticus 12. Speak to the Israelite people thus: when a woman conceives, Isha ki tazria, and bears a male, she shall be unclean 7 days. She shall be unclean as at the time of her menstrual infirmity. So just notice here that the emphasis is on her impurity. Leviticus here is a purity code. Every single thing, you touched a creepy crawly creature, here's what you do now. You came in contact with a dead body, here's what you do now. Like that's what Leviticus is doing around here. You had a skin problem, here's what you do with your skin problem. So the experience of her pregnancy is not the point. And therefore, this woman, she doesn't have a life, she doesn't have a story, she's not in danger, because the whole point is actually that she has a male child. So she's just really a reduction. Like the whole point is just about the birth and the birth of a male, and then in the next verse, or a couple of verses later, it's a birth of a female. But this woman who conceives here in Leviticus, there's no story to her. There's no bigger narrative. There's nothing else going on with her other than this. Like she doesn't have heartburn. She doesn't, she doesn't like have a dangerous twin pregnancy or triplets. There's nothing happening with her. She has no life other than the fact that she conceived and then gave birth to a boy, and nothing happened in between. And her family life is completely uncomplicated and, right? There's nothing here about her. So then the Midrash gets to jump off on that. So I just brought you, there's a whole long conversation. I brought you just 3 examples. I love these examples. I think they're so relatable. And it's amazing to hear these ancient rabbis asking questions that I think people sort of still feel today. So Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana says these 3 things. In the way of the world, I think I'm only bringing you one of the 3. In the way of the world, if a person takes a purse of money and places the opening downward, does not the money scatter? A fetus that rests in the womb of his mother, the Holy Blessed One, that's what they call God, guards him so that he does not fall and die. Is this not praiseworthy? So meaning what he's saying is, if I had something that was really, really valuable, like a purse of money, and it was in a sack with an opening, I would keep that opening towards the top. Because if I held my sack with my money like this, all the money would fall out and it wouldn't be there anymore. So Rabbi Abba Barkana is saying, like, it's crazy that the cervix is at the bottom. Shouldn't the cervix be at the top if you want the baby to stay in? And, you know, lots of people still today have that exact question. I know there, you guys have developed some new language about people whose cervixes aren't exactly up for the job. So I'm grateful for that. But there's still, right, that it get a cerclage, whatever, like all the stuff that that we do now to exactly address this problem, because there really are people who have miscarriages just because the opening is at the bottom, and that doesn't really make sense. And so you have this rabbi saying, the text is from the 6th century. All the speakers within this text are earlier. So he's probably like 2nd, 3rd century, who's saying, it's wild that the money doesn't scatter. Like, it's wild that the baby doesn't fall out. And then we have Rabbi Elazar, who says, if a person tarries in a hot place for 1 hour, does he not die? Yet the womb of the mother boils, and the fetus which is placed inside the womb, the Holy Blessed One protects it. Like, isn't it so uncomfortable in there? It is so hot. How is this baby surviving in there? And again, like, that's not like such a crazy question. Like, I know there's all sorts of reasons for this, and it's like a little anxiety inducing talking to doctors, but like pregnant people are told, like, oh, stay out of hot tubs, whatever. And I feel like there's like a vibe that connects those 2 things, of like a sense that heat can actually be dangerous. It can actually be dangerous even for a fetus. And just wondering about that, like, how does that even exist? Wow, pregnancy is insane. It is so hot in there, and this fetus survives. And then another one, which I feel like is very like 3rd trimester themed, Rabbi Tachlipa of Caesarea says, if a person eats one portion of food after another portion of food, does not the second portion expel the first? But no matter how much food a woman eats or how much liquid she drinks, the fetus is not expelled. And again, like, they weren't doing autopsies back then, so they didn't fully know how all the different things going on inside the body fit together. So they knew that there was a womb, and they knew that there was a cervix, and they knew that there was a vaginal canal, but like the relationship between those things and the digestive tract like felt very confusing to them. Or at least to Rabbi Tachlipa of Caesarea. So I would say, you know, like with our modern, not so modern even, knowledge of the distinction between those 2 bodily systems, still the lived experience when you're super duper pregnant and you eat food and then you're like, I'm about to explode is extremely relatable here. And right, like you know, I was joking before about like acid and reflux and whatever, and right, and if those are your experiences, then you realize that it might seem like these 2 systems are totally separate, but the more baby there is inside of you, the more acid reflux you have, all of a sudden it starts to feel like they're maybe more connected than you would have otherwise thought. So anyways, all to say, you see these rabbis in the ancient world sitting around saying, pregnancy is insane. What a miracle. It is crazy that this works. It is crazy that it works given how it's designed. And it is crazy that this all happens and people survive it. And they knew full well, meaning they had much higher maternal mortality rates and fetal mortality rates than we do today. But still, people survived. And that is amazing. And they were amazed by it. And there's a lot to say for that. There's a lot to say for that now. every time I've been pregnant, I've said, this is crazy. This is amazing. This is a miracle. I'm creating life inside of my body. What a miracle. And I think that's really the conversation that's happening here. But again, based on Leviticus 12, where this woman conceives and they're like, whoa, conception. That's insane. The idea that you can grow a human inside of a body, that's insane. The idea that it stays in, that's a miracle. I think that's more or less the conversation the rabbis are having here. Okay, but then we have a different conversation. So this is Rebecca. She is the daughter, she's the wife of Isaac, who is the son of Abraham. She's really important. She's a really important person. We can talk a lot about Rebecca. I think she's kind of a patriarch. There's a lot of language used to support that. But in any event, Isaac marries her when he's 40. And it takes them 20 years to have children. So we see here in verse 20, right? He was 40 then. And when the children are born, Isaac is 60. So this is a 20-year process of infertility. And during that time, verse 21, Isaac pleaded with the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren. The Lord responded to his plea, and his wife Rebecca conceived. Okay, so now we get our description of what that actually looked like for her. But the children crushed each other in her womb. It uses the strange word, crushed each other, vayitrotzitzu. So we have that same root, that ratzatz root, appears other times, but never in the reflexive form. This is the only time it appears in the reflexive form. And so there's a lot of discussion about what this word actually even means, the verb here, that crushing verb. And then she, but it's a very violent term. It almost always implies like crushed to death in other places. Okay, so the children crushed each other in her womb, and she said, here we have a woman speaking, if so, why do I exist? And she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord answered her, 2 nations are in your womb, 2 separate peoples shall issue from your body, 1 people shall be mightier than the other, the older shall serve the younger. And then her pregnancy lasts until it's time for her to give birth. And behold, there are twins. The first one emerged red, like a hairy mantle all over. They named him Esau. Then his brother emerged, holding on to the heel of Esau. They named him Jacob. And as I mentioned before, Isaac is 60 years old. So we have just this really brief description of what her experience was like. We have this crushing experience, and that's the physical experience. And then we have her statement, if so, why do I exist? And both of those things we have to ask about. We have to ask, what is this crushing thing? And what does her statement, if so, why do I exist? And that's, by the way, already, I mentioned before that translation is a type of commentary. And here, that's definitely what's going on. The Hebrew is im kain, if so, lama ze anochi, which is much better translated as why am I? Why am I? Which does not necessarily have to do with why do I exist, right? It could be that she just couldn't get a full sentence out. Why am I feeling this bad? Why am I incubating this raucous wrestling match, right? Like it could be a half sentence that she just couldn't get the rest out. Or it could be this sort of much more existential question that this translation favors. And we're going to see where this is a Jewish translation. This is a Jewish Publication Society translation. And we'll see where they get that from. So the first thing I want to look at is a midrash on this. I actually find this midrash, it's kind of sweet, but it's also kind of sad. So the midrash is asking, or picking up on when she says, if so, why do I exist? Rabbi Yitzchak says, this teaches us that our matriarch Rebecca, went to the doors of other women and said to them, did this suffering happen to you in your time of being pregnant? If so, this is the suffering of children. If only I had not become pregnant. So notice here that this midrash interprets why do I exist as why am I pregnant, right? That her utterance, her statement is actually just a wish that she had not become pregnant. And the assumption here is that her pregnancy is actually normal and that all pregnancy stinks. And that Rebecca is just the first person to give articulation to it. But the other thing that's crazy about this midrash is that it assumes that no one was talking about it. That when Rebecca gets pregnant, she was surprised by the experience, that no one volunteered, no one came over to her and said, oh, hey, like this happened to me when I was pregnant too. Don't worry, it passes or whatever. Like, that's not what happens. She's suffering. She's suffering in silence, and she's suffering in a silent world until she goes knocking on her neighbor's doors and is like, hey, you had a kid. How come no one told me it was going to be like this? Um, and I think that that's an astonishingly common experience up to today, that our culture is kind of insufficiently honest about how uncomfortable pregnancy is, even under the best circumstances. And so women get pregnant and they think it's going to be all like flowers and roses and baby showers. And then they're like, oh, like I am ill all the time. And they're telling me that this is normal. Everyone says like, oh, the second trimester is great. You're going to feel awesome, when really like maybe you stopped vomiting, but you're still exhausted all the time. And that's normal, but we say like, oh, it's going to be great, but like, it's not really going to be great. Right. So anyways, right. This midrash really starts to offer a very different picture of pregnancy, which is not only that normal is very hard and health feels like illness, but also that there's a silence about it, and that silence has been damaging since ancient times. And I would say is probably still quite damaging today. So this is now we're moving forward in the into the commentary tradition. And so Rabbi Ovadia Sforno puts a different spin onto her words. So if so, why am I? He says she's asking, why did everyone want this for me? Why did my relatives so desire that it would be I who mothers the seed of Isaac? Because when she leaves her home to get married, they bless her. May it be you who will be the source of myriads. And she's like, who said I should be the source of myriads? Like, I don't even want to be the source of anything. Like, I don't want to be pregnant. Pregnancy stinks. Why did all these people want it for me? And why did my husband pray for this for me? Which we saw, and we saw that inside in the text, that they have these 20 years of infertility, and during that time, Isaac prayed for her. And then she gets pregnant, and she's like, why did everyone pray for this for me? Sucks. This is horrible. And we're listening to Rebecca say that, and all these commentators from, we saw the Midrash, which was 6th century. We were just in 16th century Spain. Now we're back in 12th century France with Jacob ben Isaac before Shore, who explains that she was afraid that she was miscarrying. So he interprets the children crushed each other. They were breaking her. And she reasoned that it was labor pains, but it was not yet time for her labor. And so she feared that she was miscarrying. So imagine, and I'm sure for those of you who are practitioners, it's not difficult to imagine someone who was infertile for a very, very long time and then thinks they're having a miscarriage, or is in fact having a miscarriage. What a horrible experience that is, and it's a horrible tragedy. And the Bechor Shor is imagining that into Rebecca's experience. And then her reaction to it, her if so, why am I? So he's going to read it as if so, meaning if so that I will miscarry, why am I pregnant? And why did God accept our prayers, but then not help or make it come to bear? And so then when she goes and demands kind of an answer from God, God's answer of you have two nations inside of you is an explanation that actually offers her comfort. It's almost like a scan or something, right? God says like, oh no, let me help you understand what's happening inside of you, and then you don't have to panic, which I think imagining like her prophecy here as something that actually doctors and science can offer today is an amazing charge almost to people who are caregivers to pregnant people, that before Shore here, and we're going to see another person in a moment, saying that God's answer to her is mostly just informative. She's like, something crazy is happening inside my body, and God gives her the information she needs in order to calm down about it. And then she's able to carry to term because of that information. It seems like there's a causal link there. So just one more, and this one's the most intense version. So his understanding, Moshe ben Nachman, who's in 13th century in Spain, he says when Rebecca says, if it be so, here's what Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, the Ramban, says. The correct interpretation, in my opinion, is that she said, if it shall be so with me, why am I in the world? Would that I did not exist, that I should die or never have come into existence. So he's imagining for her or interpreting for her serious perinatal depression, that Rebecca is so uncomfortable, so surprised by her pregnancy, so angry about her pregnancy, that and all of the attendant, hormones and all of that stuff, that she wants to die. She's like, this is not worth it. This is not worth continuing. So we have this 13th century Jewish interpretive voice saying, this is what pregnancy can be like, actually. Pregnancy can be a catastrophe. Pregnancy can be, and this is a pregnancy he's imagining that's going to go, and that's going to go to term. And nevertheless, it is a catastrophe. It is horrible for her. It makes her want to die. And then what God offers in the prophecy to Rebecca is, he informed her that she should not fear, for the reason that the struggle in her womb for I think this must be missing some words, I'm sorry. But anyways, so the reason they're struggling in her womb is that she's pregnant with twins. Implication, Rebecca didn't know she had twins, right? So even just learning that she had twins helps bring comfort. But he assured her that, right, so at the beginning they're going to hate each other, but now they're going to rest, and she can find rest and quiet for herself. So ultimately, at the end of this prophecy, because of the information that she's been granted, both about what's happening with her now, but then also about the future of her sons, she is able to find rest and quiet. So even the ability to say, from God's perspective, to hear her and provide her with necessary information actually resolves some of her intense kind of depressive feelings. And that information has the ability to do that, which I think is pretty cool. So the last thing I want to say, and I'll just wrap up with this idea, is that when we think about these two stories that are not even stories, these two sections of the Torah, the Leviticus section and the Genesis section, were offered completely different narratives of pregnancy, right? So when we have the Leviticus section with the rabbinic interpretation around that, it's like pregnancy is just such a miracle. It's so cool. How come the baby stays in there? How come the baby survives? Wow, this is so amazing. Versus the Rebecca experience, which is a catastrophe. She wishes she was dying. She's afraid she's having a miscarriage. Or it's a totally normal pregnancy, and totally normal pregnancy still stinks, right? And her experience of it is, I don't want to be here. I don't want to be doing this. And one thing that I think the multivocal Jewish tradition really offers is that on the one hand, we have this location in Leviticus for that discussion about how amazing pregnancy is. But when it comes to Rebecca, who's like a person with a life and an experience and a story of infertility and a relationship with her husband and all this complicated stuff, no one in our tradition says, Rebecca, be quiet. Like, Rebecca, it's a miracle. It's fine. You're great. And God doesn't do that either, right? God doesn't say to Rebecca, hey, Rebecca, it's a miracle. The opening of the money bag is at the bottom and it doesn't fall out. How cool is that, right? God says, oh my gosh, Rebecca, I see that you're really suffering. Let me give you information that will help you get through this. And so I think what we're seeing here is, on the one hand, the ability to hold within one tradition both ideas that pregnancy can be catastrophic and pregnancy can be miraculous all at the same time, and a real model of where we talk about what. So when we're talking about the miracles and how amazing pregnancy is, the person who we're centering that conversation around is our woman in Leviticus who has no life. All she does is get pregnant and have this baby boy. That's the only thing we know about her. She doesn't have anything else going on. She doesn't express discomfort or like emotional suffering. And much more so, she just like moves on with her life. Versus Rebecca, who does not move on with her life, who's so suffering that she goes and demands an answer from God, right? With Rebecca suffering, actually, we say, yeah, like, this is serious. This is insane. Like, this type of suffering is so real and so part of this experience. And when we have a multivocal tradition, we can just hold both of those narratives and we can hold them in the right places. So we can say about the woman who's not experiencing any of that suffering, wow, pregnancy is an amazing miracle. And to Rebecca, we say, yeah, how can we help you? What you need right now is information. What you need right now is the skills and tools that you need to get through this. I'm so sorry for your experience. I see you and I want to help. And to be able to recognize when's the right time to pull out each of those cards, I think is just a core skill for humans. And it applies in all kinds of places. So I know today is graduation, and I'm sure the vast majority, well, you're an excellent medical school, so I'm sure all of your students know where they're going for residency, and it's all going to be perfect for them, and it's all planned out, and they're super happy, and there's nothing wrong in their lives. But imagine a different medical school where not everyone placed into the residency of their choice. Maybe graduation for them is actually not so happy because what they had planned on having next, or they don't know what the future holds next, it's not panning out the way they had hoped. And so actually you can't just assume that graduation is this happy day for them. Maybe it's the worst, because yesterday they knew what they were doing that day, and today they know what's happening, and they have no idea what's happening tomorrow. So maybe that's really messy for them. And when we have standard assumptions like pregnancy is a miracle or graduation is happy, there's a time and a place for that assumption. But with individuals who are clearly suffering in front of us, that is not the time and place for that assumption. And we shouldn't be telling the unhappy graduate, like, buck up, you made it this far, that's amazing. It's like, no, how can I help? What can I do? You need some kind of certainty about what your life is going to look like tomorrow. Let me help you with that. Not be happy, sit down. And I think our tradition really models that so beautifully. So that's what I have prepared. Really happy to take any questions that people might have. Or I said it all so perfectly that no one has any questions. Also a possibility.
I don't necessarily have a question, but I have some reflections. I was thinking about my own experience of being an OBGYN through the process of my wife and I building a family. Um, and that as we had ups and downs in our own journey, it increased my sensitivity and awareness to the multivocality of that experience. I think oftentimes they're generally like we have to live our lives in order to have wisdom, like to have that experience of like some things are good, some things are bad, some things are complicated. Um, I guess one of my questions, here's the question, like in what ways do you encounter texts or pursue texts, or should we be pursuing texts not necessarily that are reflecting on our own experience, but rather the experiences that we haven't yet had? To what extent do we have like some kind of moral responsibility to like go pursue the experiences that we don't yet understand in order to have a sensitivity to others' experiences?
Yeah, so Steven Pinker is a philosopher at Harvard, and he has this humongous book called The Better Angels of Our Nature, which I don't 100% like think every single human needs to read, but I read it. And one of the things that he talks about there is about he has this great language of literature as a perspective taking device, and that when we read things and we kind of get into the world of that literature, it enables us to sort of like second or third hand have an experience that we might not have in our own lives. So let's say in my profession as a rabbi, but maybe also in your profession as an OBGYN, right? That you're going to be dealing with people who have experiences that you have not had. And I feel that I have a professional obligation to kind of know as much about those experiences as possible. And and not just from like a Jewish legal perspective, but from a how does it feel perspective. And of course, like when you've been through something yourself, you can talk about it in a different way and you can engage about it in a different way and grow. But I do think that that growing our own kind of arsenal feels a little military, but range of experiences that we can speak to, even if not firsthand, is really important. And I think doctors and rabbis get to do that also by just walking with people. And the more people who've had an experience, even if you haven't had it, but you've accompanied those people through it, like the more you've learned and grown for next time. And I think that's also a piece of it, but I think it's a big piece of, I mean, for Pinker, this is like how we achieve peace on earth, is the opportunity to really learn and take in the perspectives of other people, and then we'll be less likely to want to kill them, which is what his book is about. But I think for all of us, just trying to be like maximally kind and maximally caregiving, there's sort of a maybe less kind of violence themed imperative to grow the number of perspectives that we can hold inside of us.
I'm just going to read the comment by P.F. Anderson. I find I'm thinking a lot about the other twins in the Tanakh, Tamar's children, and the peculiarities of that pregnancy, which were more social than physical.
Yeah, so her pregnancy is barely discussed at all, other than that it happened. And the conception is widely discussed, obviously. But yeah, but there are lots of parallels between Tamar and Rebecca, and a lot of like rich sort of individual textual parallels beyond just like mother of twins sort of situation. Women who really take control of their own destinies, women whose husbands are kind of duds, or in Tamar's case, you know, husband question mark. Yeah, there's definitely a lot there from a like, what is the experience of pregnancy like? I mean, Tamar does a lot of things while she's pregnant, so it's hard to know how hard her pregnancy really was. The other person, by the way, in Genesis, who we hear about stuff that happens to her during her pregnancy, but it's not actually about her pregnancy, is, oh, I don't know how to say this person's name in like English. Hagar, I don't know. Is that okay? Yes. I'm sorry. And she also, right, she gets expelled from Abraham's house while she's pregnant. But again, there's no sense of like her pregnancy hurt her or anything. It's all like the national or familial ramifications of her pregnancy, not the physiological or even emotional ones.
I have a question. I have so many questions actually, but I'll just try to narrow it down to maybe my main question. Before we like all logged on together, I heard you and Adam talking about like naming of babies and naming children. And I heard you say that oftentimes that, you know, this idea that like naming the baby or the fetus is such a Christian thing. And I just had never thought of that before. So I'm just trying to think of like identity in the Jewish scriptures, about how you think about identity in the womb. Because like in the passage that you read from Genesis, the Lord says like 2 nations are in your womb, right? There's an identity. He doesn't say the nations will come out of, like the nations are in your womb. So just thinking identity or naming or so, can you just comment on a little bit from the Jewish tradition there?
Yeah, so the Jewish tradition about like how alive is a fetus is really interesting. Again, really multivocal. But we think that a fetus is alive to a certain extent, but it's less alive than what it will be once its head and shoulders are out, let's say. And so the mother's life always takes precedence, and the mother's well-being always takes precedence. But at the same time, we do think that the Talmud has a debate about at what point a fetus gets its soul. And one of the opinions is, oh, it gets its soul from conception, and the other opinion is like, no, not until formation. So formation might be like around 8 weeks. We don't, whatever, that like American system of weeks, it like makes no sense in the Jewish tradition because the first 2 weeks is not pregnancy. But anyway, but let's translate 41 days to 8 weeks. But then the response by conception guy to formation guy is, if you had a piece of meat, could it survive for even 3 days without salt? And the answer is no, like it would become disgusting. So that the soul is like the salt of the fetus and what enables it to survive and grow, which means then even anything that grows, even an ectopic pregnancy then, that has no future, no potential for life, and the Jewish tradition still has a soul, but no Jewish legal authority would have any hesitation about ending an ectopic pregnancy. So even though, right, so it's complicated, we think it has a soul, but if it like is not going to survive or it's going to pose danger to the mom, no problem ending that soul's life, right? So it's like a very different idea about what a soul means, what it means to be ensouled. The other debate that we have is whether a fetus, like a miscarried fetus, will be resurrected with the dead in messianic times. We have a debate about that in the Talmud. And you see the repercussions of that in terms of burial and also in terms of actually naming. So the tradition is if the fetus that is miscarried or stillborn has form, then it should get a name, because that's how in the resurrection, in messianic times, the parents and the child will be able to find each other if it has a name. But we wouldn't name in utero, we name after it has come out, but before the burial. So that's kind of what we were talking about. It's really complicated and messy, and you sometimes see really simple statements like Judaism is pro-choice. I think like our tradition is just too complicated for that binary. And so like on the one hand, like as a Jewish legal decisor, I have been in situations to talk to people about making decisions about ending pregnancies, but it's never like as simple as, oh yeah, we're pro-choice, like the mother's life always comes first, don't worry about it, you can abort for any reason. It's like, well, let's talk about like what the mother's life has to look like to reach that criteria, because this thing has a soul. So we're not like, it's not nothing, it's not garbage, it's not a tumor. Yeah, hopefully that kind of began to address your questions.
One thing I keep on thinking about is that there's so many situations in clinical care that are so reductionistic. Like, do you have bacteria inside your bladder? If so, then you need antibiotics because you have a UTI. And I think sometimes we focus on that algorithmic thinking at the expense of this kind of like multivocal approach. Obviously, like as you're writing this book, you're focused on texts around pregnancy and commentary around pregnancy, but I'm sure you could do the same thing with death and dying and so many different aspects where questions of health and illness and well-being and wellness and lack of wellness kind of there is an intrinsic tension between a bunch of different principles or ideas, whether death and dying is sad or joyful or a moment of connectivity or a moment of isolation, right? Like I'm sure you could have texts around all these kinds of different ideas.
Absolutely.
And so one thing that I think is powerful about what you're doing is the specificity of it, right? Like it's an example of like what you could do with any subject. But I think clinically, that's what we do with any person, where we're like, who are, like, sometimes it's just like, here's the antibiotics, right? And sometimes it's like, who are you? What does it mean to you? What is the specificity with which we should like approach your specialness, like that you actually matter?
Yeah. And I would say, I'll just speak personally about like my birth experience. I was you all know that when someone says they had a baby on July 6th, so you know the standard of care that they were given was low, and that's what education looks like. And I'm an educator, and I get it. But I said to them, like, my first birth was fast. Like the minute my water breaks, I better have an epidural. And they were like, no, it could still be hours. Here's some narcotics. And I ended up having an unmedicated labor and birth because they didn't listen to my story. And it was not something that I was prepared for or that I chose. And I think that, you know, that's a piece of like some of this work is really motivated by both like motherhood education, which is like breastfeed your baby or they will die, which again is just like, why are we talking like that? But then also just by experiences of really feeling like I wasn't being taken seriously as a person who has lived experience that might be relevant.
And I have one more question, Leah, unless we have a question from the audience. If you do, please, yeah, unmute or put it in the chat. You mentioned something earlier on that, you know, about Hebrew being a gendered language, I believe is what you said.
Yeah.
And that then you also talked about Rebecca, I believe it was, and that you believe there's something in the Hebrew scriptures pointing to her as, which I've never heard this before, as like a patriarchal figure or even a patriarch. So
Mhm.
just thinking about gender and gender roles and gender language, what do you mean by that? Or where could I
Oh
learn more
yeah,
about
it's really
that?
cool. So if you want to read more about it, there's a book called Subversive Sequels, but it requires like a good amount of Hebrew literacy to understand. But basically, there's a lot of textual parallels between the way Rebecca is described and the way Abraham is described, between actions Rebecca takes in her life and actions that Abraham takes in his life, blessings that God gives to Abraham that then are also given to Rebecca and not to Isaac. And Isaac in the Torah, I think, comes off as this like really damaged person. It's not a mystery where that damage happened. Like the binding of Isaac was a really traumatic thing that happened to him. But what that means, in my opinion, is that the reins of Jewish destiny then have to be kind of carried by his wife. And I think that you see that in a number of places, both like before the marriage. In we have this long description of the kind of courting process, and even what Abraham's servant goes to find. This person goes to find Rebecca, not Isaac himself, right? Isaac doesn't get to pick his own spouse. And the descriptions of even what he's looking for are Abraham traits. And that what he finds is a woman who takes initiative. That's the core thing that he's looking for, is a woman who takes initiative, and who shows leadership traits. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Our time is up and we have to wrap up in a second, but PF Anderson has one more comment here. I find your mentions of breastfeeding in Jewish tradition interesting. Rabbi Ruth Reagan has spent a lot of time the past few years talking about the right of the mother to choose to not breastfeed, and that this choice should not be stigmatized or punished medically or socially. Could you expand on this a bit? Maybe just
Yes.
a few words on that, and then
Okay, just a few
we'll wrap
words.
up.
I'm familiar with Ruth Reagan. I'm a big fan of her work. Yeah, so I actually plan in the book to have two chapters, one that's basically like breastfeeding is awesome, and one is like breastfeeding is terrible. And I think both can be fully supported by Jewish texts. And so the texts that she's working on are all these kind of legal texts of like who gets to decide whether you breastfeed or not, and in a case of divorce, because the father is actually responsible for the nutrition of a baby, but mom is the one whose breasts are involved in that nutrition. So like what happens if you divorce and you have a baby who's breastfeeding? How does that pan out? All sorts of really interesting, complicated questions. What if there's a divorce and dad's responsible for nutrition and mom doesn't want to breastfeed anymore? Can mom opt out at that point, even though there's a relationship established? The Talmud has like a whole test to determine, and at that point, basically the baby gets to decide, which is fascinating. Then like having any agency to a baby is extremely unusual in the Jewish tradition. So anyways, like it's the whole thing, breastfeeding in Jewish law is like a huge source of fascination for me. Glad to come back some other time and talk about it. But yes, I think we're at time. So
Thank you so much.
thank you.
I really appreciate it. I hope others enjoyed as well. We have a thank you in the chat, so we hope that the rest of the book writing process is smooth, and we look forward to reading and engaging further.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Have a
Leah.
good one.
Bye,
Thanks
friends.
for having me. Happy graduation,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Thanks.